The week my grandmother was buried, my brother got a Tesla. That's not where the story starts, but it's where I always end up when I try to explain what happened. Because the moment I saw him toss those keys in the air and catch them, standing in the driveway of her house, 3 days after we'd watched them lower her into the ground, I knew something had already gone very wrong, and I was the last one to find out. My grandmother's name was Rosalind. Everyone called her Roz. She was 79 years old, sharp as a blade until the very end, and she had spent 40 years building a textile company from a single loom in a rented garage in Savannah, Georgia, into something that employed over 200 people and had her name on a building downtown. She never remarried after my grandfather died. She never slowed down. She showed up to her own chemo appointments alone because, she said, she didn't want anyone fussing. I was the one who drove her anyway. I'd moved back to Savannah 3 years before she got sick. My marriage had ended quietly. The kind of ending that doesn't involve shouting, just two people slowly turning away from each other until one morning, you realize you're sleeping on different schedules on purpose. I came back to the city I'd grown up in, took a job doing accounting for a small architecture firm, and started having Sunday dinners with my grandmother because neither of us had much else going on. Those 3 years were the best of my life. I didn't understand that while they were happening, the way you never do. She taught me how she'd built the business, not in a formal way. She wasn't sitting me down with spreadsheets, but in the way she talked, over chicken and butter beans, about the decisions she'd made, who she'd trusted, who had disappointed her. What she'd learned about people when money was involved. Wealth doesn't change people, she told me once, refilling her sweet tea. It just removes the effort of pretending. I wrote that down when I got home that night. I still have it. My brother had come back to Savannah too, but for different reasons. He'd burned through 2 business ventures in Atlanta, one involving a food truck and one involving something he described as curated experiences that I never fully understood. He'd moved back 8 months before Roz died, and he'd started spending time at her house, more than he had in years, taking her to lunch, calling her on weeknights. I told myself it was nice, that he was growing up. My mother lived 40 minutes away in the house we'd grown up in. She and my grandmother had always had a complicated relationship, the specific kind of complicated that exists between a woman and her son's wife when the son is no longer in the picture. My father had died when I was 11. My mother had remarried. My grandmother had always been polite about it, but she kept her distance and my mother kept hers. When Roz got sick, my mother showed up. I will give her that. She came to some of the appointments, she brought casseroles, she sat with her when I couldn't, but there was something in the way she moved through that house that always made me uneasy, like she was measuring rooms. I told myself I was being uncharitable. Roz died on a Tuesday in October, early in the morning, when the light was just coming through the curtains and the ceiling fan was still going slow like it always did. I was there. My brother was not. My mother arrived 40 minutes later. I don't want to linger too long on the grief, because that's not really what this is about, but I want you to understand that it was real, and it was large, and it sat on my chest for weeks afterward like something with weight. She was the most important person in my life. She was the one person who had always seen me clearly. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral, at the offices of her attorney downtown. I'd met him once or twice at her house, a quiet man named Mr. Calloway. He had a way of looking at you like he was listening to something you hadn't said yet. My brother drove separately. My mother came with her husband, my stepfather, who had no legal reason to be there but whom my mother brought everywhere, the way some people bring a coat even when it isn't cold. Mr. 2. Calloway read the document in a measured voice, pausing occasionally to take a sip of water. The company, a controlling interest in it, went to a board trust with instructions to sell within 3 years and distribute proceeds to a list of charitable organizations Roz had specified. That part my brother didn't like. I watched his expression shift. A beach house she owned on Tybee Island went to my mother outright with no conditions. The Savannah house. Her house. The one she'd lived in for 31 years. The one with the kitchen where we'd had all those Sunday dinners, went to my brother. He couldn't fully contain his smile. I got a letter, read aloud by Mr. Calloway in the same measured tone. It said that she loved me, that she was proud of me, that she trusted me to understand. There was a jewelry box, her mother's pearls, a first edition book she'd known I loved. That was it. I didn't cry in the room. I sat very straight in the chair and looked at my hands, and I listened to my brother ask Mr. Nye listened to my brother ask Mr. Mile Calloway clarifying questions about the deed. My mother reached over and patted my knee once, and I had to concentrate very hard not to pull away. On the drive home, I called my closest friend and told her what had happened. She was silent for a moment, and then she said, "That doesn't sound right." "It's legal," I said. "It was her choice." "I know. I just mean, it doesn't sound like her." I'd been thinking the same thing, but I hadn't let myself say it yet. That night I went back to the house because I still had a key and there were things of mine there. Some clothes, a box of books, toiletries from the years I'd practically been living there during the worst of her treatment. I let myself in through the back door, the way I always had. My brother was already there. He was in the living room with a woman I didn't recognize, and they were talking in low voices about which wall to take down to open up the kitchen. He looked up when I came in, and there was a beat. Just a beat, where he had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Hey," he said. "I was going to call you. I just need to get some things." "Sure, yeah. Take your time." He paused. "Although, we're probably going to start on the house pretty quickly, so." I looked at him. "So? Just, sooner is better." I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed in the room I'd used for 3 years, and I looked at the wall and I thought, she trusted me to understand. What did that mean? What was I supposed to understand? I packed a bag. I took my books. I took the jewelry box. I left the key on the kitchen counter without saying anything. The next 4 weeks were a specific kind of hollow that I hadn't felt before. I went to work. I came home to my apartment. I ate dinners I couldn't taste. I thought about calling my mother, but every time I picked up the phone, I put it down again, because what would I even say? I thought about the beach house, her beach house, and I thought about how my mother had probably already started redecorating. I thought about the last real conversation I'd had with my grandmother, about 3 weeks before she died, when she'd been having a good morning and we'd sat outside on her back porch with coffee. She'd been quiet for a long time, looking at the garden she couldn't tend anymore, and then she'd said, "I want you to know that everything I've done has been deliberate." I hadn't thought much of it at the time. It had seemed like something people say near the end, a kind of accounting, a reassurance. But sitting alone in my apartment a month later, I kept turning it over. Everything I've done has been deliberate. The call came on a Wednesday morning while I was at my desk pretending to reconcile a spreadsheet. It was Mr. Calloway. He said, "I apologize for not reaching out sooner. I've been trying to determine the right moment. I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. To your knowledge, did your brother and mother read the will in its entirety?" I didn't understand the question. "You read it aloud," I said. "At the meeting." "I read a portion of it," he said. "There was a second section. I provided printed copies to all parties before the reading. I assumed everyone would review the complete document. I should not have assumed." The room went very quiet. "What's in the second section?" I asked. He was silent for a moment. "Ms. Maz." He said my name quietly. "I think you should come into the office." I drove downtown with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. I kept thinking about what my grandmother had said on the porch. Deliberate. Everything deliberate. Mr. Calloway's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Bull Street, old and wood-paneled and smelling of coffee and paper. He was waiting for me at the door. He handed me the full will, the real, complete version, and pointed to the section I hadn't heard. I read it twice. Then I set it down on his desk and looked at him. "She knew," I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. "She'd been watching for some time. She told me she wanted to see what certain people would do when they believed they had already received everything they were going to receive." He paused. "It's an unusual approach. But your grandmother was an unusual woman." The clause, the part no one had bothered to read past, outlined a condition attached to both the house and the beach property. In order for the transfer of title to be legally finalized, both recipients had to certify, within 60 days of the reading, that they had reviewed and accepted all terms of the will, including a series of obligations, maintaining the charitable donation schedule my grandmother had established, keeping 2 specific employees of her company on payroll through the transition, and one last provision that was so specific I almost laughed. My brother had to offer me the right of first refusal on the Savannah house before any renovation could begin. He hadn't. He'd already started pulling permits. My mother had to transfer the beach house deed to a joint holding with me if she intended to rent or sell it within the first 5 years. She'd already listed it with a realtor. Neither of them had read past page 9. I want to be honest about what I felt sitting in that office because I think it matters. Part of me felt something sharp and hot, the kind of thing you feel when you've been holding very still under something heavy and the weight finally lifts. My brother standing in that driveway with the car keys. My mother patting my knee with her careful hands. The 4 weeks of hollow. All of it compressed, and then suddenly, in that office, expanding. But there was another thing underneath that, and it's the one that came out on top. I thought about Roz on that porch, about the way she'd taught me things not by lecturing, but by showing. About how she'd spent 3 years of Sunday dinners telling me, in her particular way, what she believed about people and choices and the cost of doing things right. She hadn't left me the house to punish my brother. She'd left the clause to show me what I would choose to do with it. I already knew the answer. Mr. Calloway walked me through the legal process. When the 60-day window closed without certification, both properties technically reverted to a holding estate pending resolution. I had legal standing. He was very clear about that. He was also very clear that what I chose to do with that standing was entirely my decision. I called my brother first. He picked up on the second ring, which I'd expected. He'd probably been getting calls from his contractor. I told him what I knew. I gave him time to absorb it. When he started to say something defensive, I just let him say it and waited until he was done. Then I said, "I'm not taking the house." Silence. "I don't want to live there," I said. "That was never what this was about for me, but I need something from you." What I asked for was straightforward. He would complete the renovation if he wanted to, but he would honor the 2 employees Roz had specified. He would make a donation, in her name, to the literacy foundation she'd supported for 20 years, and he would sit down with me once, and look at the photographs I had of us with her, the ones from those last 3 years, and acknowledge that they were real. That last part wasn't in any legal document. It was just what I needed. He was quiet for a long time. "Okay," he said finally. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. I called my mother after. That conversation was harder and shorter and ended the way it needed to. She could keep the beach house. She would keep it in the family rental pool for 5 years as my grandmother had intended, and the income would fund a scholarship at the vocational school where Roz had taken her first business classes 40 years ago. My mother said I didn't know about any of this so many times that I stopped counting. "I know," I said. "Read the whole thing next time." 3 months later, I was standing in Mr. Calloway's office again, signing paperwork. My grandmother had left one more thing. In the second section, past the clause no one had read, past the conditions and the provisions and the careful instructions, there was a paragraph addressed to me directly. It said that she had placed a portion of her personal savings, separate from the business, separate from the properties, into a trust in my name. Not because I had done anything to earn it, but because she had watched me show up for 3 years, not for what she had, but for who she was. And because she believed that people who understood the difference between those 2 things were worth investing in. It wasn't a fortune. It was enough to matter. The last line of the paragraph was not in legal language. It was just her voice, the way I'd always heard it, unhurried and direct. "You always knew how to sit with me in a quiet room without needing anything from it. That is rarer than you know, and it is worth more than anything else I could give you." I folded the copy of the document and put it in my bag. Outside, the November light was doing something complicated over the river, that particular Savannah light that turns everything gold and a little sad, and I stood on the sidewalk for a minute just breathing. She'd been watching all along. She'd seen everything. And in the end, the thing she'd trusted me to understand wasn't a legal clause or a piece of property. It was that she had known me, really known me. And she'd made sure I would know that. even after she was gone. I think that is the only inheritance that actually lasts. I've thought a lot about what Roz was actually doing in those last 3 years, not just spending time with me, not just having someone drive her to appointments. She was watching. She was paying attention in the particular way she'd always paid attention. Quietly, without announcing it, the way you'd observe a plant to see whether it's growing toward the light or away from it. And I think what she saw in my brother and my mother wasn't cruelty exactly. It was just the ordinary human thing of wanting, and not bothering to look too closely at what the wanting was doing to you. They didn't sit in that attorney's office and decide to hurt me. They sat there and heard what they'd been hoping to hear, and they stopped listening. That's a different thing. But it has the same effect. What I've come to believe, not because anyone told me, just because I've lived long enough now to see it repeat, is that the choices we make when we think no one important is watching are the ones that end up defining us. My brother wasn't performing for anyone when he tossed those car keys in the driveway. My mother wasn't performing when she patted my knee with those careful hands. They were just being exactly who they were, in a moment they thought had already been decided. Roz knew that. She'd built an entire company by understanding it. The thing about integrity, and I don't mean the word the way it gets used in speeches, I mean the actual daily practice of it, is that it costs something in the short term. I drove her to chemotherapy for 3 years. I sat in waiting rooms with bad coffee and fluorescent lighting, and I didn't do it because I expected anything back. I did it because she was my grandmother and I loved her, and that was enough reason. That's it. That's the whole story of why things turned out the way they did. There's a version of this where I'm bitter, where I spend the rest of my life measuring what I gave against what I got, keeping a ledger, deciding who owes what to whom. I felt that version pulling at me during those 4 hollow weeks. It was real. I'm not pretending I floated above it on some current of good character. But here's what I keep coming back to. The people who stopped reading at page 9 didn't get away with anything. They just revealed, in the most efficient way possible, exactly who they were. And I think they'll carry that knowledge whether they acknowledge it or not as punishment. Just as the natural weight of knowing what you chose when it counted, what I want. For myself, and honestly for anyone who's ever been the one left standing in a room feeling like they got the smallest piece, is to stay curious about people rather than closed off by them. To keep showing up with my whole self even when I'm not sure it will be recognized. Not because it always pays off in some neat, documentable way, but because the alternative is becoming someone who only gives what they expect to get back, and I've seen what that looks like and I don't want it. Roz left me something I can't deposit anywhere. She left me the knowledge that she saw me, that the years were real, that she knew the difference between presence and proximity, between love and strategy. That is, as it turns out, worth more than a house,